One of the things that's one of my favorite strategies with couples is what I call marital multiple choice.
Mm.
Go to your partner, especially if there's a little bit of conflict, and say, hey, rather than, hey, I want to do this, or I think we should do this. They're going to say no just out of principle. And so you go to them and say, I've been thinking and I really want to honor and respect you. I want to be a good partner. So here are the options I've thought of, A, B, C. And, D would be if you come up with an option that's even better for you, but I can sign off on it too. And that's so easy. It's such a simple technique. And the recipient usually feels very respected and honored because they've seen that you're not just trying to get your way, but you're thinking this thing through. It's one of the easiest relational hacks that can have huge benefits and I think reduce conflict by at least 80%.
Have you ever heard the phrase becoming the best version of yourself? Yeah, me too. But what does that even mean, and how do we become that person? I'm here to help you navigate through those questions and come up with actionable steps in order for you to live your best life. We've got to discover what we want. We've got to figure out a plan on how to get there, and then we have to go. We can't just sit and wait any longer. Life won't wait on us. So come join me on this constant journey to become the best version of yourself and to find your best you. I'll see you on the other side. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nick Carrier's Best You podcast. I'm super fired up today. We're going to have an absolutely awesome conversation with the one and only Dean Hall. Dean, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today.
Nick, it's a pleasure. I've been looking so forward to this. It's amazing what you do, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you in particular.
Well, yeah, I greatly appreciate that. Right back at you. So Dean is a record-setting swimmer, a two-time cancer survivor, a therapist, a motivational speaker, and coach. And we already talked a little bit about those things off camera and off podcast. So I'm super excited to dive a lot deeper into them right now. You worked 3 decades as a clinical marriage and family therapist, and you continue to do so a few days a week, as we just discussed. And you're the first person to ever swim the entire length of the Willamette River out in Oregon back in June of 2014. And you're the first person, I guess, to swim the River Shannon in Ireland.
Yeah, don't guess about it, Nick. It's a fact.
Yeah, it's a fact.
Yeah.
Right. That's awesome. So basically the way I want to start today is where you had leukemia and lymphoma back in 2013. And then you decided to swim the Willamette River in 2014.
Exactly.
Why?
Well, I was dying. And I knew as a therapist, reading Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, I knew that purpose, because I'd even seen it with clients that I'd worked with, I knew that purpose had the power to bring me back to life, or at least give me my best chance. And in 2013, I was down to 159 pounds. And my family jokes that I've never been a pretty boy, but man, I was ugly. I looked like I mean, you could see every rib, you could see my pelvic bones, and I was just emaciated. I was gaunt. Biggest thing on me were my lymph nodes. They'd swollen to the point where I couldn't turn my neck, and under my right arm, I couldn't put my right arm down fully because I'd had a lymph node that my doctor lovingly called my hockey puck, because it was exactly almost the size and shape of a hockey puck. And I had just, because I'd lost my first wife 15 days before our 30th anniversary in 2010, I just had lost my drive for the first time in my life and lost my will or zest for living. And I was looking in the mirror in August of 2013, and I didn't even recognize this guy that I was looking at. I looked at his eyes, and he was so sad that it kind of shocked me. And I thought, if I just let this thing go and just take me, no one will know or blame me. But then instantly, it was almost like with a shock, of realization, I remembered I got a 21-year-old daughter who's just amazing and wonderful and the light of my life. And she just lost her mama. And it was an entirely selfish thought that I was thinking. And so I thought, I've got to do something to come back to life, or at least leave my daughter with a legacy of courage. And so I started asking, I don't know if you know it, but the brain by its very nature has to answer every question you ask. And the problem is many of us ask really crappy questions. And so then we get hundreds, if not thousands, of really bad answers. And it just makes us feel miserable and stuck. So I started asking, what would get me excited about life again? And what would be a wonderful way that even if I died trying, it would leave my daughter with something to be proud of. And I would stop several times a day and even prayerfully kind of meditate on that for a few minutes and then let it go. Yeah. And nothing. I expected to get an answer within a day or two. Nothing. And then a couple weeks later, I thought, well, if I'm not going to get an answer, I might as well clean up my place, because I just moved into a dark little duplex. I was renting for the first time in 30 years. It felt like a huge failure. But I thought, yeah, I'm going to unpack these boxes and maybe decorate my place so that it feels like a sanctuary. And so I started unpacking boxes, and I ran across a journal that I'd been forced to keep when I was 12. And I thought, well, I wonder what the 12-year-old dean said. So I started flipping through this thing, and it said, 2 things I have to do when I become an adult. I have to climb Everest. I have to swim the English Channel. Well, I knew there was no way in my state, and with my financial burden from being a cancer patient, I was climbing Everest. But I thought, I think I can swim the channel, which is kind of crazy. But man, it put me in that sweet spot, Nick, right between absolutely being terrified because it was such a big goal, and absolutely excited. Every time I'd think about it, for the first time since my wife died, my body would just kind of come alive, and I'd get excited. And so I decided to go to my oncologist and tell him, and he absolutely freaked out. He's like, hell no. You get in a public pool, it'll kill you. And I said, well, I'm dying anyway, doc. What do you want me to do? Die watching Wheel of Fortune? Yeah. Not gonna go out that way. And so looking back on it now, I didn't really think about how I was gambling my life just getting in a public pool. But I did it, and the first time I did it, I could only go 11 laps, and it took me over an hour. Yeah. But I felt like myself for the first time in 3 years, and I felt excited. And so that's what I started doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. I think, first off, I love man's search for meaning, so I think that's really cool. And I really love the phrase how you said that purpose has the ability to bring you back to life. I think that's a really cool phrase. And something that's like, for you, it kind of was almost literally life and death. But for a lot of people who just like lack motivation for whatever reason, they don't have the drive. If they just can go back to trying to define some sort of purpose for themselves, then that's all they need to like get a little bit more clarity on and get a little bit more of a finger on in order to start increasing their own drive and increase their own internal motivation, which is something that you did a really great job of, I feel like. So when you started to take on this challenge, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward towards you actually doing it. What was the most unexpected challenge that you faced when you actually swam the river?
Well, one of the things that I do that really helped me, I did several practice swims, so there weren't a lot of unexpected challenges. But one of the things I do that's very unique that I would really like to offer your listeners, especially if they're in the endurance or CrossFit realm, is it's real popular for Olympians and sports medicine to say, hey, visualize the perfect performance. Well, that's good, but what I see these high performers doing is when something goes wrong, they kind of freak out, and many of them quit. So what I did for months is I imagined myself ending and doing this successfully, but very imperfectly. I imagined it to be extremely hard, extremely cold, that I'd be tired, maybe even swimming injured, that it wouldn't be fun. I would imagine all this and then blend kind of a weird form of radical acceptance with sports imagery. I'd see it being difficult, but me overcoming it, still having fun, still doing it. So when I actually got in the water, Nick, it was exactly how I imagined it. It was hard as hell.
Yeah.
And for the first week and a half, the first 100 miles, everybody just thought I was insane. So the media just stayed way away because they thought this guy is a weirdo cancer patient that's trying to kill himself. We don't want to be a part of that. But once I got to 100 miles, they're like, wait a minute, this story might turn out kind of good. So they jumped in. But I think, to answer your question more specifically, the one thing that I didn't give enough credence to is the water was right at 40 to 42 degrees. And I'm spending 10 to 12 hours. And within about, because I had less than 6% body fat, and even with the 3 mil wetsuit, I was having to get out about every 45 minutes, get on the riverbank and do jumping jacks and run in place because I was going into deep, what they call deep core throttle. So battling hypothermia was probably the toughest thing, and it was expected, but I had no idea what a big opponent or challenge that would be.
Yeah, well, I love how you were able, or I love how you visualize the things going wrong, because I've actually had a few people on the show now really talk about that.
Really?
I had a lady, because it's something you don't hear that often, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So I had a lady who was a sports agent for a lot of different people, but she was a sports agent for a golfer named Billy Horschel. And he said that the biggest piece of advice that Tiger Woods gave him was that, yes, you want to visualize yourself succeeding and making that putt, like hitting a drive right down the middle of the fairway, but you also need to visualize yourself screwing up. You also need to visualize yourself missing the putt and missing a drive, because you need to visualize how you respond to those particular things. And then I also have had like a fighter pilot who talks about just making sure that you think of all the things that go wrong so you can prepare for those, think of all the contingencies. And just so many people, or just not, I guess not so many, just a few people that I brought on, because I hadn't really thought about it before. And I think that's just really important, because you have to fully immerse yourself into the situation before you're into it. And if you kind of do that, I think your mind has the ability to potentially pick out some of the things that could go wrong. And then once you do that, your creative juices start to flow in terms of how you can start responding to those things and not let them force you to quit or hold you back too much. So then that's something that's really cool that you were able to do beforehand.
Well, the really cool thing for me is you just put me in the same league with Tiger Woods and a fighter pilot, man. So I don't know. My head's now so big I can't fit it on the screen. But I'm going to be quoting you. I mean, you're already one of my favorite podcasters, but I'm going to be quoting Nick Carey. Well, Nick said.
Yeah. Nick said I'm like Tiger Woods. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Of course. I got to hand it to you. So what do you think from this first swim in 2014, the Willamette River, what do you think is the biggest thing that you learned about yourself after competing it? Or maybe during the challenge?
Yeah. Boy, I don't know that I learned that much about myself as much as I learned about my position in the world. You know, in Western culture, we're taught that we're separate from each other and separate from nature. And moving for 22 days with the current and constantly feeling the power of that river and moving with it, I became so connected to the river. I started calling it Mama River. I felt like I was cradled in her arms. And I just, they're using water now. Have you heard of Wallace J. Nichols and the Blue Mind? Yeah, they've found that it doesn't matter race, religion, gender, age, anywhere they find people, if they put them in, on, around, by, or underwater, their brain chemistry changes within a few minutes. And they're starting to use it with veterans. It's a really
How does it change?
It calms, it relaxes, and then they found it kind of creates a feeling of nurturance or support. You feel connected and soothed in some way, and so then you can let go of some of these nightmarish traumas that you've experienced. And so they're using it for anxiety, depression. They're using it for especially PTSD. And really what I had was what's called traumatic bereavement, a form of PTSD. I was hardly ever sleeping before the swim. I'd have several nightmares about my wife dying because she was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and we didn't see it coming at all. 52 days later, she's dead, right before our 30th anniversary, and she'd been my world. And so I just was really traumatized by that, without sounding too melodramatic. But there was a huge change just being, and I'd never read about the Blue Mind. So I just noticed that every day I swam, I felt more connected to nature, to the river, and less grief-stricken, less broken, stronger. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's super crazy because I had never heard of that until you brought it up. But like, anytime people are on water, like, they're enjoying themselves for the most part, right? If someone's on a boat, they're rafting,
Right.
people always feel more at ease. They don't think about their problems as much for whatever reason. Everybody loves going to a lake, going to beach. And even if you're just like in a city that has water and you're around the water, like you're exercising, like in Chicago, this past summer, I was running along the lake, and it's just like, it soothes you. So it's crazy that your brain chemistry actually changes. And I think that's such a powerful thing that if you know that you can take advantage of more often if you're going through these sorts of circumstances. But I kind of want to stick on this a little bit. First off, I'm very sorry for your loss back in 2010, and especially how fast that happened. But after having lost your wife, what was the biggest thing that you learned about yourself after having lost her?
Well, that I'm a total screw up. Probably not what you expected me to say. No, I'd always been hard charging. I'd always made good decisions. I was raised by two mountain climbers who were very driven themselves. And I had always kind of been the good kid. And so I'd been very careful, very disciplined, put myself through college, worked the first time I didn't have more than 2 jobs. I was 42. So I'd always worked really hard and saved and been very methodical. And even I hate to admit it, but I think there was a bit of hubris that went with that success and that form of discipline. Because even when I look back now, when I was trying to help people, I'd make sure they didn't, I didn't ever say anything like this, but I look back, and when I was working with people, I think, okay, well, I'll help you out, but man, I would never have done that, or I would never have made that choice. And there was a bit of pride and arrogance that was hidden from my view. And once my wife died, I was so devastated that I almost kind of was angry and a bit almost childishly rebellious. And I made all sorts of stupid mistakes, said all sorts of horrible things. and just acted like a dumb teenager or something. And it was all extremely regrettable. And the biggest part I regret is how hard that made it for my daughter, because she saw this very stable, steady dad acting in ways so in many ways she felt like she'd lost both parents. So I learned that I'm entirely human. And because of all that I'd done and how steady and successful my life had been previous, I think there was a hidden pocket of pride there. And I thought that I was kind of immune.
Gotcha. So what were a couple of keys then? Like you said, it took kind of a couple of years really for you to,
Right.
I mean, I don't know if you ever maybe fully get over it, but it took you a couple of years to get to the point where you were able to maybe move on. What do you think were the couple of keys in order to help you move on and recover from realizing you were a screw up? I'm only saying that because that's your words.
Yeah. No, feel free to call me that anytime you want. The reason I believe my story is extraordinary is because I'm entirely ordinary. And I'm nothing big, always wanted to be, always worked to be. But the beauty of my story comes from the fact that I'm really not. And so anybody can do what I did. And I think that offers real hope. But some of the key moments were coming across that dream and going for the English Channel, and then realizing that even a big dream like that, if you give it room to expand and be flexible, life will lead you. There's one day in November, I'm walking out of the pool and it hit me. Who cares if another middle-aged guy puts on a Speedo and swims to France? It does the world no good. And in my case, it's not even going to be a pretty picture. So what am I doing? And so for a couple of weeks then, I very prayerfully started to ask again several times a day, how could I do this and not make it about me? Do it in a way that benefits the world. And that's when I remembered that ever since I was 24, I wanted to swim the entire length of the Willamette River. And so I found out that still no one had. And I was only born 4 blocks from the Willamette River. So it's always been a part of my consciousness and a part of my story, especially my childhood. And 187 miles. And here's the thing, you got to remember, I still didn't know if I was going to make it and if I was going to live through this. But I thought, if I swim the English Channel, my daughter can be like, yeah, he swam the English Channel. But if I swim the Willamette, she can say, yeah, I lost my dad, but he was the first person in history to do this thing. And I mean, how many opportunities do you get to do that?
Yeah.
And so it just stirred this passion inside of me. And so it was finding something that I was passionate about. And I think that's so important. Yeah.
Well,
And you said earlier that even if people aren't dying, but I think if they're not passionate about something, they're dying a slow death. I really do.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you kind of brought this up again, because this is something that I wanted to make sure I mentioned earlier. Is you said that this goal was kind of right on that threshold of extremely terrifying, but still kind of like extremely exciting and something that you thought like could potentially be doable. I don't know if you follow the work of it's not the exact same concept, but I don't know if you follow the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, but he always talks about this edge of order and chaos, and how you always kind of need to push yourself. You always need to test that limit of what you're actually capable of, or what you're just not quite capable of. You always kind of need to test where that is and gradually try to level that up as you go throughout your life and continue to challenge yourself. And that's kind of what I thought of when you talked about like extremely terrifying, but something that really jazzed me up and really excited me, because I think a lot of people, when they set goals, maybe they set a goal and then they realize it might not be realistic, and so they lose the excitement and they lose the passion for it. Right. So you kind of need to find that threshold. And again, that's so cool that you were able to do that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I
But
think goals need to be way beyond realistic. I think if you're not absolutely terrified, that goal isn't big enough.
yeah,
If it's just a little threatening, well, you're going in the right direction, but it's not enough to really get you passionate. It's got to be terrifying.
yeah,
That, like I said before, that sweet spot between terror and total excitement.
yeah. I agree that it needs to definitely scare you, but I definitely need to I definitely believe that people need to have some sort of belief that it could come true.
Sure.
Because if you don't have any belief, I don't think people are going to continually take action on making it come true.
Right. Right.
Um, but
That's well put. Good point.
thank you, thank you. So let's go to, and like I said, back in 2013, you had leukemia and lymphoma,
Mhm.
and you decided to go no chemo and no radiation. Is that correct?
Right.
And
Yeah.
just want to simply ask, what was the thought process behind that?
I've had my dad's a two-time cancer survivor, and he's a man's man, man. He was a talk about a guy that's hard to follow. He has climbed all the peaks on the West Coast and Mount Hood here. Uh, our largest peak in Oregon. He climbed when he was 9. He's climbed it over 25 times. And then he's run most of the world's major marathons. I mean, this guy's a tiger. And to see what chemo and radiation, the long-term effects did on him. And then I've had several clients where they've had elected to have chemo and radiation. They weren't forced, they weren't toward the edge of death, but they elected to, and saw the long-term effects on their organs and arteries. I thought, absolutely not. I'll do it if I have to as a last ditch effort. But I think there are better ways. And I'm a real believer that our bodies are so magnificently made that if we hook into the things that really superfuel them toward health, they have much more propensity to heal than to create disease. With cancer, especially, I think there are two forms of cancer sources. One is environmental. So many people back in Kansas are getting cancer because they had crop dusters fly right over them, with DDT and things, and so environmentally they got poisoned. But I think the larger share of us, it's emotional. We're holding on to anger or sadness or fear or hurt or loneliness or guilt or shame. And we're holding those in our body and suppressing them so intensely, it creates a dysfunctional state inside of our body, a state of disease, and finally it breaks down. And I think that's clearly what happened to me. Yeah, I was angry, I was lost, I was confused, and I was just absolutely grief stricken. And I just held that in my body,
Hmm.
and it broke it down.
Okay, gotcha. And then so 2 weeks after your swim on the Willamette River, you went back to the doctor and you got blood tests and they found you were cancer free, correct?
Right. It was
Wh-
a little more than 2 weeks, but yes.
Okay. Okay.
And I knew I was feeling great,
Yeah.
but I thought it was just because my head cleared. And the doctor's like, oh my gosh, if we hadn't diagnosed you ourselves, we'd think somebody misdiagnosed you, because I had a form of leukemia called chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and it just tears down. It's not a fast acting killer. It just tears down your immune system and kind of acts like AIDS, and you die slowly. And usually only old folks get it. And the one thing they told me the first time I was diagnosed with it is, it will be here forever. The best you can do is manage it. And I'm like, nah, I don't think so. And they thought I was delusional and in denial. I'm like, no, what the body creates, it can heal. And they just look at me kind of sad and sympathetically, like, oh, this poor dumb guy.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happened.
Wow. That's awesome. So cool.
Yeah.
So when you went to going on to the next first ever to swim the River Shannon in 2017,
Yeah.
what were maybe some of the similarities and commonalities between this challenge and the Willamette, and maybe what was a couple differences?
Yeah, there were more differences than there were similarities.
Okay.
Uh, the one thing that was similar is once you start passionately pursuing a dream, at first you are entirely alone. Even your friends and family, and I've found this with many people now, it's the common part of really going after a big dream. At first they're like, yeah, no, this is kind of stupid, you're just dreaming, and they try to talk you out of it. And so that's kind of a common part. That was a similarity. And at first nobody's interested and you are walking down this thing alone. But then once you start doing it and you're moving forward, it's all of a sudden like springtime comes and everyone wants to be a part of it. And especially over in Ireland, the Irish are so generous and friendly. And I was working to raise money for the Childhood Cancer Foundation of Ireland. Once they found that this crazy Yank was swimming their river, but going to leave the money there for their children, they couldn't do enough for me. So that was pretty cool. The thing that was different was the Shannon was as harsh as the Willamette was sweet. There was no current because it's pretty much just 200 miles of lakes. So I had no assistance. What I didn't realize is in June, it's kind of their windy season because they're an island. So the wind sweeps off the ocean from the south. And so out of 25 days it took me to swim the Shannon, 23, I had a 10 to 25 mile an hour headwind. And a lot of people don't know it, but when you're out swimming in a river or a lake and you've got a headwind more than 15 miles an hour, it moves the first 2 feet of water in the direction of the wind. So it was like trying to run or swim 200 miles on a treadmill. I was just crawling for each inch and each scrap. And then the other thing that was very, very difficult is access to the river was hard. You couldn't get in and out like you wanted to. And probably one of the hardest things was the riverbed was made of flint and shale. And when that cracks, it creates razor sharp edges. So anytime I'd try to crawl out of the river, I'd just be slicing my hands and feet up. So I bled every day in the river. Yeah. So it was just almost torture. Yeah.
Geez, a few unexpected challenges. That one. Oh my Lord.
Yeah. And one of the biggest challenges is unexpectedly, I fell in love again in 2015 to a beautiful fitness model. And I thought, if she's interested, who am I to say no? I gotta see what this lady's like. And when I found out she's just as beautiful on the inside as she is the outside, I just fell deeply in love. And so we got married in December of 2016. And I had my dad, my 79-year-old dad, had been my guide boater leading me through the Willamette. And it was such a beautiful, sweet time between us that I wanted that for my daughter. My daughter was now 24. I thought this would be a perfect rite of passage. Being on the river had really healed my grief. It might be a chance for her to heal her grief. And then the whole first week, I am struggling. I am sure I'm going to fail. And it was awful what was going on in my head. I thought, I've just spent $12,000 to come over here and show my daughter at the start of her adulthood and my wife at the start of our marriage what a big fat failure I am. And so I just had to work. Usually it's not hard for me to overcome those, but it was just absolutely, it seemed like there was no way I was going to be able to accomplish this thing.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. Well, you did, and it's
Yeah.
behind you, obviously. But something that I'm really interested to talk about today is
Okay.
actually your work as a therapist. I think that there's so much there that
Mhm.
I could selfishly learn from, and that
Yeah.
a lot of people listening could learn from. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And you
Sure.
said you've done it over a little over 3 decades now. And we talked beforehand, which is so one thing I didn't realize was that you did a lot of work with sexual trauma
Right.
and that thing. And you mentioned off podcast how you've been doing it for so long, but a lot of people on average maybe spend like 4 to 6 years doing it and they just kind of get burnt out from it. So what was maybe one of your biggest struggles early on as a therapist that you had to overcome?
Well, probably it's the only time in my life that I had kind of the imposter syndrome. I
Mm,
knew that I was walking into people's lives, which to me is sacred ground, and I'm just winging this baby. Even though I had a master's and wonderful mentorship, I thought, oh my gosh, I know so little. And so just being able to go and sit with people, but that's where I learned how important it is to be authentic.
mm,
And so if I'd run up against something, which I often did early on, that I could not really handle and I didn't know what to do, I just say, hey, you know what? I'm new at this. Don't know, but I've got a brilliant mentor. Let me talk to him. I'll give you a call. And the thing that really impressed me is not only did people then feel more comfortable with me, but they had more confidence in me,
mm.
which I thought they'd have less because I didn't know what I was doing. So that was very, very difficult.
Yeah, I think that's really cool because, like you said, it taught you to be authentic and it taught you to be honest. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me is that that's what people trust. And
Right,
and so the phrase "fake it till you make it" is something that I don't really like. I
right,
think it definitely has a place, but I think a lot of people, maybe in your situation, if they were told "fake it till you make it," will try to give their best advice to people as a therapist as they think they can, and in that sense, they don't ask for help, or they don't maybe do all the preparation or do all the study or do all the work that they potentially could, because
right.
they try to fake it till they make it. But I think that's
Yeah.
really cool that you made sure that you were authentic and you were honest with them. You're like, okay, I don't have the answer. I'll go get it for you from somebody who has a little bit more experience and then help you out. And like you said, it just built trust with it built trust between you two. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, yeah. I don't like fake it till you make it either. I changed that to stay till it pays.
Mm,
Um, and if you just don't flinch and stay in and are honest in just about any situation, there will be incredible payoffs for you and the people you're working with.
I like it. I like it. So, as you were working with different like couples, I guess, and some families
Mhm,
and stuff, was
mhm.
there any particular person or couple or group of people that you think you learned the most from because of their particular situation? I'm not asking who they were or what their
Of course.
situation
Yeah,
was, but
sure.
was there any particular thing that you maybe learned most from a person or a couple?
Yeah. Early, I mean, I could give countless stories. I'm
Right.
always learning from others. And one of them was I'll just tell you two quick ones. The first one was an old guy named Saul who had built a shoe store empire. And he was one of my first clients. And he had lost his wife. He was in his 80s. And I think he was just lonely.
Yeah.
And he would come in and he would teach me, and he taught me brown shoe, black shoe. Have you ever heard this?
No.
Yeah, I hadn't either. I asked him a question once, and he's like, "Ah, Dean, you're asking me that question wrong." And I said, "Well, Saul, what do you mean?" He's like, I started my first store during the Depression, and I would walk up to people and I'd say, "Do you want to buy this shoe?" And they'd say, "No." And then I realized they'd say no just to feel independent and like they had a brain in their head. But then I found out that if I walked up to them and said, would you like this shoe in the brown or the black? They would pick one of those. And so he says, you've always got to give people choices so that they can feel independent. And I thought, wow. And so he went up. I said, Saul, are you sure you want to come to me? I think you're helping me more than I'm helping you. And he's like, no, I love talking to you, Dean. And so I learned a ton from him. And one of the things I learned from him, I already kind of had it, but it cemented for me, it doesn't matter how a person looks, especially how old they are or what they've been through. If they're older than you, they've probably, unless they've been just a total asleep in life, they've got some wisdom you don't have. And so I started trying to be around older folks and just picking their brain. And once I started doing that, I started learning so much. And I think we've got such a youth-oriented culture. I think we lose the wisdom from the older grandmas and grandpas. Yeah, so I learned a lot from him. The other guy, and this guy actually saved my life. He was working with me and he was an executive, and he'd retired. He was way up like a VP of a well-known corporation, and he'd given that up. And as is true for most men, his generation especially, he was really depressed because he'd lost his identity. Well, I had been a teacher for 20 years in this community, and I knew 6 of his grandchildren, and they were the brightest, most wonderful kids imaginable. And so I just wanted to shake him and say, hey, you've got all this money, start taking your grandchildren around the world and having these fun times and talking and speaking into their lives. But I hesitated, and I'm glad I did, because I said, you just need a big dream, something that has the power to bring you back. And he said, okay. And he came back a couple weeks later and was really excited. And he says, I found it, Dean, I found it. And I kind of sat back and smiled. I thought, okay, he's going to tell me he's rediscovered his grandchildren. And I said, what is it? And he said, I've decided I want to become one of the world's greatest wooden duck decoy carvers. What the hell is that?
Yeah.
But I made sure not to laugh, and I bit my tongue. And man, he went after this thing and started going around the world to the best wooden duck decoy carvers and learning from them. And within a couple of years, he was in the top 10 and showing me these wooden ducks that he was making $1,000 to $5,000 off a piece. And before I left Kansas, I ran into him. And he said, Dean, I want to show you some pictures. And I'd never told him what I thought. And he showed me pictures of him going around the world to these conventions, and each time he'd take one of his grandchildren. Oh. So it came full circle. So it was really cool, and it really brought him back to life. And if it hadn't been for that guy, when I was dying, I would not have probably thought of and known firsthand how following a passionate purpose can bring you back to life. So I learned so much from him.
Yeah. I love that takeaway from the second guy and the first guy too. I think the brown shoe, black shoe. I never heard it phrased like that, but I've definitely learned that through my own experiences, that you have to give people choices, because that's like one of the things that I've realized in terms of booking people for as podcast guests. If you just ask somebody to be a podcast guest, or you ask somebody to meet for coffee, and you just leave it like that, you're never going to meet them, or you're never going to interview them. You have to be like, here's a couple of times. Do any of these work for you?
Sure.
And then it's actually going to happen. Because that's what I realize when people ask me now, or ask me to like meet up or something like that. I'm like, either I'm going to give you a couple of times, or give me a couple of times, and then we'll make it happen. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. I feel like, and I feel like so many times that has such a role in so many different people's lives too. I feel like as like a salesperson, you have to give people a choice. If they have too many options, then it's too much complexity to where they're never going to actually take action and choose something.
Exactly.
They have to have a couple of options. So like you said, they can feel like they're in control of it.
Right, right. And it's extremely helpful in an intimate relationship.
Mm.
I found, because, and this makes me sound a little OCD, but in order to sit for my licensure test, I had to have 2,000 face-to-face sessions. And once they got me counting, being an old jock, I just started keeping count. And this year I passed 53,000.
That's
So
awesome.
I've done a little bit. And one of the things that's one of my favorite strategies with couples is what I call marital multiple choice.
Mm.
Go to your partner, especially if there's a little bit of conflict, and say, hey, rather than, hey, I want to do this, or I think we should do this. They're going to say no just out of principle.
Mm.
And so you go to them and say, you know, I've been thinking and I really want to honor and respect you. I want to be a good partner. So here are the options I've thought of, A, B, C. And, you know, D would be if you come up with an option that's even better for you, but I can sign off on it too. And that's so easy. It's such a simple technique. And the recipient usually feels very respected and honored because they've seen that you're not just trying to get your way, but you're thinking this thing through. It's one of the easiest relational hacks that can have huge benefits, and I think reduce conflict by at least 80%.
Mm. I love that.
So yeah, yeah,
I feel like that comes down to just like being super clear
right,
about kind of what it is you want. And if you're clear about it, then the other person knows like yes or no. Because if it's too vague, you don't really know yes or no to whatever it is they're offering or whatever it
right,
is that you're
right,
talking about.
yeah,
So that's really cool. So you mentioned something earlier in the podcast, kind of early on, about how the brain has to answer every question that you ask it.
right.
I want you to expand a little bit more on that and talk about how we ask ourselves crappy questions and how we can stop that.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Cognitive behavioral therapy says that underneath cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most well-respected, highly regarded, highly researched forms of therapy. And the basic tenets of it are that when we end up in problems in our life with heavy emotions, those just didn't, you know, spring full blown out of the head of Zeus. They are generated. And so in cognitive behavioral therapy, it used to be that thoughts create feelings, feelings create actions. And then more recently, in the last 10, 20 years, it's been belief systems create thoughts, thoughts create feelings, feelings create actions. I go one deeper. I believe beneath the bedrock of your beliefs are questions that you've asked, that your beliefs are actually an answer to the questions you've been asking. The problem is we are asking ourselves hundreds, if not thousands, of questions every day subconsciously. Silly things like, what am I going to wear? Is this going to be a good day? Does my wife still love me? Is my car going to turn on? Does everybody think I'm cool in this car? I mean, just crazy,
Yeah.
nonstop floods of hundreds of questions. And so the first thing I think you have to do, and this is where meditation or some kind of practice of silence and introspection is so important. You've got to be able to start tuning in and listening to what's actually running through your brain all day long. So that's really step one, is developing some practice where you're starting to listen in and tune in so that you can more easily identify the questions you're asking.
Mm.
And then when you start identifying it, rather than fight it or say, oh, I should be asking better questions, or I'm such a slime ball or stupid for asking these questions, you know, berating yourself, which I see is a very natural reaction in our society, is once we find out what we're doing, then we judge ourselves harshly. And if you can let go of judgment and just be more observant and almost scientific about your observations, then you're really in a dynamic spot for learning. And so you start tuning in, noticing what they are, and even journaling them, your most repetitive questions, and then transforming those questions. And one of the things that there are two things, Nick, that never failed me after my wife died, and I would go to these time and time again. One of them is something I developed I call QTE, or question transformation exercise. You identify the negative question that's making you so miserable, because our bodies, I believe, are the ultimate feedback mechanism. And when we are feeling bad, it's usually our bodies trying to shift us back onto a good path, rather than we're just crazy. That's why we feel anxious or depressed, is because I believe it's the answer. Those physical manifestations many times are the answer to a negative question we've been asking. And so you identify what that negative question is, and that's usually pretty easy to do because you've been asking it 100 times that day.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I would write that down, and then I would go to what I call a positive flip. I would try to reword that question in a positive way that's equally powerful for the positive as this negative question was. And many times when we're asking negative questions, it's victim-oriented questions like, why me? Or what's going to happen now? Or, something like that. So I think the magic word is how. I will go from why me to how can I handle this? Something, but a lot of people don't understand it too. We each have our own highly specific dictionaries, and the brain and the body respond to what I call juicy, delicious words. And Nick's juicy, delicious words are going to be different than Dean's. So I will write it, and then I'll ask it with my eyes closed to see if my body responds. And if my body really likes it, then I will go to the next step. And I won't go through the whole thing, but I'll just tell you briefly. I think the big three, because I've got too many degrees and too many majors, Nick. But one of them is in world history, and another one is in philosophy and religion. And so one of the things I know is that in all of the major world's religions and almost every culture ever known throughout the history of man, there have been three elements involved in just about every culture, except for a couple small tribal Amazonian cultures, and that's faith. There's always some kind of faith element, hope, and love. Those are the big three, and you never hear about those as natural sources of power. And so I am constantly asking myself, how am I doing in terms of my own faith practice? How much hope am I carrying and giving today? And how much love am I carrying, experiencing, and passing on today? Those are my litmus tests, because I think they're universal. They've always been, and they always have been, they always will be, I believe.
Yeah.
And so then I'll take that question, and it's got to stay in question form, because again, you want to access that natural tendency, knee-jerk reaction. The brain has to answer it. So then I'll change my question from positive and add an element of faith to it. Then I'll add an element of hope to it. Then I'll add an element of love to it. And the question that I end up with is just this beautiful gem. And then I'll go back to the original question, and it doesn't take a nuclear scientist to figure out the difference between the two. And that never failed me. Many times I'll journal this, and in my extreme grief, it would give my mind something to concentrate other than my grief. The other thing that never failed me is preparing. I'd never heard about Wim Hof or the Wim Hof method or cold water immersion, but I knew the Willamette was going to be cold. And so I started taking ice baths just to prepare my body. And I started calling it poor man shock therapy. I could be just miserable, have not left my duplex for days, hadn't shaved for days, just totally miserable, get in an ice bath, boom, I'm fine, I'm okay for about an hour or two. And the oncologist also thinks that being hypothermic in the Willamette for 22 days, 10 or 12 hours a day, is what really healed my leukemia. And if you want a good read, you should read Scott Carney's What Doesn't Kill Us. It's talking about the research on cold water immersion. I'm now a huge fan. There's a group out of Phoenix called Morozko Forge, and Morozko is the Russian Jack Frost. And they sent me a cold water immersion tank that's 6 feet long, and I keep it at 40 degrees, and that's how I start every day. And I'll spend about 4 or 5 minutes in this just brutal cold, and it boosts my immune system. It takes down all my inflammation. It boosts my metabolism. And then anytime I have a really hard workout, I'll go and spend 10 minutes or so in this, and it'll take down all the inflammation. I mean, I feel like I'm your age and I'm turning 60. It's one of the coolest things I've ever found.
That's awesome. Well, that's great. Some great stuff with the ice bath, and I really liked the your breakdown of being aware of the questions that you ask yourself. I think people need to honestly rewind and like listen to like that last 5 minutes of that again and take notes on it, because I know I will. Is about, because kind of you went through like the process of how you become more aware and how you can start flipping that. And I really liked the distinguishing between the why question that you're currently asking yourself and how you can flip that to a how, because I think when you flip it to a how, you take ownership of being able to reverse it.
Exactly. And that's why I love listening to you, Nick. You're so quick, and you're not only quick at understanding it, but you're extremely adept at applying. That probably speaks to why you're in the position you're in. But yeah, you got it. You got it, man. And one of the things I want to offer your listeners is they can find me on Instagram the most at any time under Swimming in Miracles. And I would invite not only you, but them, anytime you have any question on anything I've discussed, DM me. I'm happy to take my time and answer any question. If there's any way I can help somebody get it right and accomplish their dreams, man, I'm in.
Well, I really appreciate that. I know everybody, make sure you go follow him, Swimming in Miracles, on Instagram, and swimminginmiracles.com, his website, and everything like that. Well, Dean, the last question I want to ask you is, I believe that becoming the best version of yourself is a constant journey. I think we're always chasing down that best version of ourselves. I don't know if we're ever there. To me, I feel like I should never think I'm there, because I don't want to get complacent and stop working towards them.
Exactly.
And I also believe it's a unique journey. I think we all have certain principles and certain lessons that we need to all apply. But I also believe that like the way I'm going to get to the best version of myself is going to be different than the way that you get to the best version of yourself. So with that being said, I want to ask you, for you personally, if there are 3 things that you could currently do, or 3 things that you could currently work on to get closer to the best version of yourself, that best version of Dean Hall, what were those 3 things that you could do, or that you could work on?
Yeah, I'm constantly working on myself. One of the things that makes me sad is this next year in 2020, I'm turning 60, Nick. I don't know how it got there, but I am officially an old man now, but I don't feel like it. As a matter of fact, one of the coolest things that's happened for me is I fell in love with a woman who's my age, and thankfully she looks about 10 or 20 years younger. But she also is super excited about life and building businesses and doing things at a time when most of our friends are settling down and just wanting to sit on a couch and watch TV or scroll through Facebook. We're getting more and more excited about our life. So one of the things that I'm constantly working at is refuting ageism. And I'm not my 20-year-old self, even though I feel like it, but I just don't believe in limits. And I think we've been sold a bunch of goods on this whole aging process. And so, and I think most of that is our vision. If we still are dreaming dreams and trying to accomplish big things, no matter the age, it leads us to have an excitement for life that's gearing up rather than winding down. And so I think it's constantly important to push yourself to grow and say, okay, that was fun, but rather than just do that, how can I do something even bigger than that, something even harder, something that stretches what I learned and applies it in even a bigger arena? And so that's one of the things I'm working on. The other thing that I'm working on is biohacking, just finding ways to be even more intentional about what I ingest. One of the things that just cracks me up, and I'm always running these little experiments, right?
Yeah.
And the last 23 clients that I've had that are on medication, I'll ask them, has your psychiatrist, the psychiatrist, and that's nothing against psychiatry, but they will just agonize over milligrams of antidepressants or psychotropic drugs, but they will never ask, what are you eating or drinking? The last 23 clients I've had, I've asked, hey, has your psychiatrist ever asked you what you eat and drink? Because they'll agonize over milligrams of a drug, and yet we're ingesting kilograms of junk, which creates the brain chemistry. And so I'm really working on being much more intentional at looking at food as only fuel, and how can I super fuel my body so that as a 60-year-old man, I can accomplish even bigger things. Because I won't tell you the name of it yet, but this next year, as a celebration for my 60th year on Earth, I'm planning on swimming a river that's 1,200 miles long, which will take me 90 to 110 days. So when I say I'm swimming next summer, I'm swimming all summer.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to, even though when most of my friends just want to sit and watch their grandkids or the Golf Channel, nothing against grandkids or the Golf Channel, I love them too, but I'm trying to do something that maybe I wouldn't have known how or even had the guts to try when I was in my 20s or 30s.
Awesome.
So I think that's really important.
Cool. Well, I got it. Well, before we leave, I want to make sure I acknowledge you. I think that it's so cool that now that you're 60, you still think so big. And I think that's just super cool and super unique. And how when you made you swim, you made it so much bigger than you. That's what you said. You're like, when you were doing it, you're like, what is this really going to help if just this guy, again, in a Speedo, goes and swims this? That's not going to help anything. But you're like, I want to make it bigger than me. I want to leave my daughter with something kind of to be proud of too. And then you also mentioned it, and during this last segment, how now that you're 60, you're still looking for a bigger purpose. You're always looking for that purpose to keep you alive and keep you motivated and keep you driven, which I think is so cool, because so many people, like you said, at your age are starting to settle down and aren't looking and seeking out for a bigger purpose. And that's probably when their health starts declining faster, their drive starts declining, and everything like that. So I just think it's super cool and super unique, and I'm blessed to have been connected with you.
Well, if you don't, I am thrilled just to hear you say that. That's a gift, Nick, because I respect you and what you're doing so much. You're doing so much more than I believe I did at your age. So I just can't wait to see what happens in your life. But let me leave you with this. I'm writing a book now that I'm hoping to release it next spring before my swim. And I believe goal setting is good, but there's the name of my book, the working title is From Goal Setting to Soul Setting. And when you set a goal, a simple goal, many times there's not a do or die, life or death commitment to it. And then also, it might be a goal that somebody else told you you should go after, or you think would make you look like a big, important, powerful, successful person. And that's where goals fall short. I call it leaping into the success of an empty life. I see that happen so many times with high performance and elite athletes. They've succeeded, but their life's still empty. The difference between that and soul setting is when you follow a dream that you're uniquely suited to, and it's so big that you're more excited about it than anyone else. And something inside you just says, man, I gotta do this. Then when you do it, you inspire everyone else. But the coolest thing that happens is it's about service, and it's about offering something to our world that's way beyond you. And if your goals are just about you, for you, to make you look better or make your life better, it's not enough. And so ask your heart, what would do the world more good? How could I do this so big that it's way beyond me? And when that's the difference between goal setting and soul setting, between trying to accomplish something and following a crazy, wild, impossible dream. And the crazy, wild, impossible dream we're all capable of. Yeah.
I love that. That's a heck of a way to finish. Well, Dean, when you come out with that book and before that swim, we'll have to have you back on the show so we can talk more specifics about that and about the upcoming journey that you're gonna go
I'd love that, Nick, because I'm going to be watching you till then.
on. Well, I appreciate it, Dean. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, you too. Thanks so much.